in the beginning, it didn't seem like a big deal to kind of keep some things to myself. But gradually, when you start justifying keeping something to yourself, especially when you're truly curious and you don't understand, or there are quite obvious contradictions, we say we want progress, but it's interesting that we're using extremely intolerant tactics, including not asking any questions, right? Having a list of people that are so-called problematic that you can't listen to. So I'm not allowed to listen to Jordan Peterson, not allowed to listen to Joe Rogan, not allowed to listen to anyone that is on the right, you know, and I didn't question any of these things, which is what also started to ring alarms for me in 2020.
I'm safe though. You can listen to Scott Barry Kaufman.
Now I'm
safe. I'm safe. Yeah. Today we have Africa Brooke on the show. Africa is a London-based consultant, credentialed coach, strategist, and international speaker who tackles self-sabotage and self-censorship. Her first book, which was recently released, is called The Third Perspective: Brave Expression in the Age of Intolerance. In this provocative discussion, we discuss the importance of diversity of thought and how to increase your own brave expression. I found this chat very inspiring, and I really enjoyed Africa's positive energy. So let's get into it. We have begun! Africa Brooke. Thank you so much for coming on the Psychology Podcast live in studio in Brooklyn.
Thank you. You have just the most magnetic energy. And I mean that hat. Can I honor you for the choice? Is it
just because
hat?
of the hat I'm wearing that I have that? Would I have that
everything.
magnetic energy without the hat?
You have it without it, but even more so with it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And some ground rules. If at any point you need a chill pill, just ask me and I will give you my chill pill. Okay? This is a safe space.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Oh, I love that so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
So congratulations on your new book. Is it your first book?
It's the first
It's your new and first book.
New and first. And I never, ever thought, I've always been a writer since I was 10 years old, but I never thought the book that I would write would be this one, which is why I think it's probably one of the most important and bravest things I've ever done.
So, like, let's say 5 years ago, if this version of you said to that Africa Brooke, you're going to write a book called The Third Perspective: Brave Expression in the Age of Intolerance, what would that Brooke have? What would that Africa Brooke said? Or even 10 years?
I would have. I think intellectually, I could have seen that it might be possible for me to write a book about courageous expression, about bravery, because 5 years ago, I was already starting to put myself out in the public as someone that was willing to have hard conversations. However, the content of what I write about in this book, which is a psychological study of what we call cancel culture, and there's a reason why I'm saying what we call, and I'm sure we'll come back to that.
For sure.
A psychological study of the level of intolerance that we've sort of created culturally, and me saying we need to push back against this, and we need to do that compassionately but very firmly. I don't think I would have thought that would have been the book, because I was in so many ways in the clutches of my own self-censoring. So I would have been terrified to call out some of the things that I'm calling out.
Terrified? Well, you're not terrified anymore.
No.
I feel like you're almost the opposite now. You're like, give me the microphone.
You know what? I'm no longer terrified, but I still experience discomfort when I need to call out certain things.
Really?
And I think that's fine. I actually think that's useful.
Maybe that's human.
Yeah, it's absolutely human. And I think I want to keep that part of myself alive where I feel stretched by my own actions, where I'm like, oh, this is a growth edge. Am I really going to do this? And then I do it. Ooh. I don't want to sort of create my own internal bubble, because I think then it can be easy to expect everyone else to behave in the same way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I love that. Did you say growth edge?
Yeah.
Did you just come up with that phrase?
No. It's a term in terms of, edge is already a term, kind of pushing yourself to an edge.
Yeah.
And I think of it as my growth edge, because it's exactly that. I don't know that there's any other way for me to experience true expansion if there isn't some level of discomfort, right?
That's a theme across your whole book.
Yeah.
It's a theme you talk about. We talk about being a rebel, and you talk about a lot of things, but I think that's I think that's a thread that runs through the whole book, is the growth edge. I love that phrase. I'm going to be using that phrase.
Please do.
All
and
the time
I feel like not even feel like, I know that the reason I resonate with you and your work and what it is you do is because you invite people to do that in your work. Even how you explore self-actualization, that's exactly what it is. You constantly stretching yourself, right?
Yes. I do Pilates as well.
Oh, yes.
So
can we do a session while I'm in New York? That's a yes. Thank you.
I'll think about that. I don't know if we're ready for that. Okay.
Shall we move on?
What did you say?
I said, shall we move on to the next?
Yeah. We'll talk about that later. So you were born in Zimbabwe, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Wow. Okay. So, and how many years did you live? I want to know all about you. Okay. Yes. So how many years did you live in Zimbabwe?
I'm 31 years old now. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, left when I was 9 years old.
Okay, 9.
But it's so interesting how when you hear the age 9, it's young, right? But those years were so significant and they truly, truly shaped who I am. And I remember my young life so vividly. I remember my upbringing in Zimbabwe. I remember walking to school for about 40 minutes it took to walk to school, which seemed like a very short journey at the time because walking is just a normal part of, my culture. I remember climbing trees. I remember playing every single day outside. I remember the exact journey from Harare, which is the city, to Gweru, which is the country. I speak my mother tongue. It's still my first language now. When someone says, where are you from? I say Zimbabwe. I'm a Londoner. I don't even say I'm British, which is interesting enough. I feel like I'm British by passport, and I really honor that and value it. And I think it's one of the biggest privileges, actually, passport privilege. I don't know that we talk about that enough. But culturally and intrinsically, in terms of who I am as a person, I'm Zimbabwean first, Yeah.
And what was it like, growing up in Zimbabwe?
Yeah.
Like, did you grow up poor?
Does
anyone grow up rich in Zimbabwe?
Some people do. Some people do, but it's interesting how, even though I would say my mother is the one that grew up in true poverty when she was growing up. She had 10 siblings. And she lived in Gweru, the countryside. So my mother's family is from there. And my father's family, our ancestral land is Chiweshe, which is also in the rural countryside. But most of them migrated to Harare, the city. But my mother and father grew up in actual true poverty. But it's interesting because when we were growing up working class in Zimbabwe, I realize now that we had very little. We had what we had. We could survive. We could go to school. We had a lovely home. But we really didn't have much. But we were never made to feel like victims. And I think this is a really important part of my work. We were never made to feel like we didn't have anything. We were in a community with people that had much, much less. And even those people were never victims in our eyes. Never. And it wasn't because we're not acknowledging the reality of what is. It was a both and thing, right? We acknowledge the reality of our lives and we're not victims to this.
Well, that's it.
Right?
That's it.
Yeah.
Being able to hold both. It does feel like many people in our society today are capable of holding both those things in their mind at the same time.
Absolutely. And the way that I grew up, I'm also grateful that I had siblings, 2 older sisters, 1 younger brother. So even though we grew up in a home where there was domestic violence, my dad was an alcoholic and he could be quite abusive, physically abusive when he was drunk, and eventually even when he wasn't drinking, it just became a part of how he was towards us. But in the name of holding those multiple truths, I always say this and I'll never stop saying it. I really learned to hold multiple truths about my father before I could even, intellectualize it in that way, because he could be abusive. He could be very, very scary. And I mean very. But he was also a very gentle man at the same time.
Interesting.
He was also really funny. He was also someone who could walk into a room and without needing to be loudly confident, you could just feel Maxwell's confidence, And because he was a teacher from 19 years old, he was a teacher. So he was obviously very compassionate and patient, which was a very stark difference to the man that I talk about when I'm speaking about the abuse.
Yeah.
But I realized that me and my siblings and my mother grew up in an environment where we had to hold multiple truths.
Yeah.
Where there was so much certainty in times, but so much uncertainty because you never knew what mood this man was going to be in.
Sure.
You know, but my upbringing, as much as it had so much darkness in it, it also had so much light. I'm so glad, and I could really honor this now as an adult, to be from a collectivist culture where you know your neighbors, not even just know them. You know them very well. They're your aunts and they're your uncles and they're your second mothers. And they will come and twist your ear if you're staying out too late in the same way that your mother would.
Yeah.
They love you. They will feed you. They will give you everything they have. That's the culture that I'm from. So even though the abuse was contained in the home, outside of it, again, we were still not victims to it. And I know it can be a very difficult thing to understand through a Western lens. And I'd love to know what you think. But I realize now that it was never as clear cut to say, he's the abuser, you're the victim.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Or, I mean, you're able to see multiple sides of a human.
Yes.
Which is, and also, wow, this sounds like you have a little bit of a capacity for forgiveness within you as well, which is incredible.
Now,
without excusing. Forgiveness without excusing.
Yeah.
Incredible. And so obviously all this made you who you are today. I mean, like discussing all of this, you know, it's, you know, it all led up to this triumphant book release that you have, you know, and the themes of this book.
Yeah.
It sounds like you had a major change a couple years ago where you went from this kind of social justice warrior persona. I use the word persona intentionally because it sounded like you really never felt really authentically connected to it. If that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I gather. And then you kind of had this transformation, and then you wrote this viral article. Could you kind of talk a little about this transformation you went through? And,
absolutely.
Do you recommend this transformation for everyone, or just you?
I think that historical context that I've just provided is very important because I'm leading with things like never grew up to be told that I'm a victim or even remotely believed that I was a victim. Came to the UK at 9 years old, and this was the early 2000s where there were no conversations about inclusivity. That time was just a very different time, which is also important because sometimes we have this tendency to look at the past through the lens of where we are right now. But it's important for me to bring that up because we did face in many ways actual racism. I would say more so my mother. She was in her 30s at the time. She went into the field of nursing because she was a geologist in Zimbabwe. But none of that meant anything by the time she came to the UK. The relationship with Zimbabwe and the UK was very fractured towards the late 90s, early 2000s. There were sanctions placed on Zimbabwe. There were just harsher restrictions on Zimbabwean citizens who wanted to come over to the UK. So a lot of her education, things that she'd worked so hard for, coming from a poverty-stricken background, it meant nothing. You know, it wasn't applicable here. So she became a nurse, and depending on what industry you're in, you're just treated like absolute shit. And racism was a very big part of that. But again, she was never a victim to it. She didn't come to the family home and talk about, even though it was very difficult to be a Black woman at that time, these were not just things that became a part of her identity and then they became a part of how we viewed the world. There were just things she experienced and she didn't hide them from us, but we weren't to take this as proof that we're less worthy. So growing up, victimhood was not a part of my story in any way. And I mentioned those things, but I did end up getting captured in many ways by Western ideology because I was that young, but also young enough to still remember my historical context from Zimbabwe, but also young enough to assimilate very quickly and to adopt Western thinking very, very quickly. So outside of the family home, I was being told that I should feel X, Y, Z because of my race. I was being told that I need to work twice as hard, which might have some truth to it in some ways, but it's also not the absolute truth for everything that I will experience. I was being told that I I'm to refer to myself as a marginalized person. Again, we can acknowledge the truth of that. But does that mean that I need to walk through the world thinking that I am marginalized, I am a victim,
or that's
I am
your like
disempowered?
that's the main identity,
right?
You know, what if you don't want that to be your main identity? Yeah.
So regardless of me not wanting to actually take those things on, like deep in my bones, if you hear things enough times, you will soon buy into it.
Yeah.
And if, let's just be honest, if there's also social credits for who can be the most victimized, you will also start to find a benefit in identifying more, you know, with the sort of victimhood role. So you starting to identify more as, oh, I am an immigrant. Again, you are an immigrant. That's the objective truth. But does that have to be worn as some kind of grievance, some sort of heavy thing, like I am an immigrant, so I deserve to be treated? It just became a little bit warped for me over time. And because of the work that I had been doing from the age of 24, when I finally got sober, I was speaking out about my addiction, and I quickly got labeled a sobriety advocate, which I was very grateful for.
Let's not gloss over this. So you went, because we hadn't discussed this yet, that you went through a period where you were addicted to alcohol and drugs. Is that right?
From 14 up until 24. So for a decade.
So young.
So young.
Wow.
But it's I don't know what the culture is like here, but in British culture,
that's normal.
Heavy drinking, it's just seen as normal.
Yeah.
It's just seen as...
I know. I lived in England for 10 years.
Really?
Yeah.
There you go.
In my 20s.
It's the social glue for absolutely everything.
It really is. The club nightlife is the pub life.
Everything.
So it makes it easier to get addicted.
It does. Yeah. It does. Because again, like I was saying, I was young enough, even from 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, when I discovered alcohol, young enough to still remember my historical context. I had a father who was an addict, and it was bad news through and through. I understood that. But also it's still young enough to be curious about the new culture that you're in, to see the freedom of young people. Oh my goodness, they're allowed to swear in front of their parents. They're allowed to drink. They're allowed to go out. They're allowed to... So there was a sense of freedom. It was kind of my first exposure of freedom. But unfortunately, alcohol was also a part of it. Yeah. And I started to buy into another idea, which is that to access freedom, I need to drink. To access freedom, I need to change my state of mind. But also, you know, drinking at such a young age made me forget about my differences. It made me forget that I was the only Black person, you know, in my friendship group. It made me forget that I was an immigrant. It made me forget that I spoke a little bit differently. So all the insecurities kind of washed away. So I started to associate freedom and alcohol. You know, that I could only be free within myself if I was drinking. Wow.
Well, you went through you have a lot of things here that you admitted to. Can I just go through the laundry list of...
Please.
Okay. Decade-long struggle with alcohol and other drugs, fractured relationships. So there, you had a lot of maybe tumultuous relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Compulsive sexual behavior.
Yeah.
Because
again, and that part is important because...
Was that tied in with the alcohol?
Absolutely.
Okay.
When I started drinking, sex was a part of it too. So I started to associate sexual freedom or expression with alcohol. So until I got sober 10 years on, that association was always there, not being able to be sexual unless I was drinking.
Oh my God. So that's a condition upon.
Gosh.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not a lot of people don't admit a lot of these things.
No.
So that's the kind of bravery you're talking about as well. Yeah. And bringing that in a non-victimized way. I think maybe that's the bravery. Maybe that's what the bravery is.
Yes.
So you had a missing front tooth? I don't see that. I don't see it.
Yeah, because they fixed it.
They put in a new tooth.
It was just, but again.
Your teeth look great, by the way.
Thank you. You would think that would shock someone into making a shit, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't even a big deal. It wasn't it's so crazy. This was in 2014. It wasn't even a big deal. It was just like, okay, so this has happened. I can own it as a quirk.
What, did you get in a bar fight or something?
Kind of thinking.
Like, how did you...
This is even more insane. I can only laugh at it now. I was toothless for maybe 3 or 4 months.
Okay.
But it became a party quirk. It became like just this little thing and a story that I now have. So again, in the book, I write a lot about denial, and I talk about it through the context, first recognizing it in that phase of addiction. but it's an invitation for all of us to recognize where is there proof that something needs to change here. Yeah. But we take it on as sort of like an identity piece. We kind of rework our lives and our value system so we can make peace with this and stay in that denial. I was walking around toothless in London for 4 months.
Oh wait, how do you get the tooth? You're avoiding the question. She's like, I hear you, Scott. I hear you. How did you get to the point where you didn't have a tooth?
I was drunk.
You don't have to answer any of my questions.
No, of course. Please, I'm an open book. I will answer everything. It wasn't even anything remotely different from what I used to get into all the time. I was leaving a party after maybe a 3-day binge. So it was no longer even a party. It had become maybe even like a sort of crack den environment.
Wow.
Always so thankful, by the way, that I never tried harder drugs. I'm always grateful for that. I preferred, there was still caution when it came to that. Never did crack, never did heroin. Oh yeah, no. Crack den feel. Yeah. Okay. Without the crack.
I thought you were saying I never did more than crack. That's what,
only crack and booze. Thank you.
That's all I did. That's all I've done.
That's where I draw the line. No, I'm so grateful that I never ventured there, but I would go on these day-long binges.
Okay.
And
did you get a manic state?
Did I go into?
Were you in like a prolonged manic state during that time?
Tell me what that would look like.
You sort of felt like God, or you felt like you're invincible, or like you couldn't sleep, like.
Oh.
Like your thoughts were racing?
For me, it was mainly just not wanting the party to end.
Okay.
Just wanting to sort of create my own reality where we don't have to go home.
I see.
We don't have to see the sunlight. We don't have to go outside. We can just we need more drugs. We can just bring them into this environment and let's not leave.
I see.
And even if you find the most kind of the people that are willing to stay for the party, at some point people have to go home. They have their real lives. But I had nothing outside of this bubble.
I see.
So it was in one of those instances, and I was just leaving the party, and then I fell. It was like a basement, and then I was walking up the stairs, still in a drugged state, and then I fell, and then I smashed my face onto the concrete step. It could have ended really badly.
Yeah.
That fall, it could have ended really, really badly. Yeah. So I thank God that it was only a tooth.
Yeah.
But again, I had to somewhat justify what was happening. So you just get up and you continue, you make fun of it, you make a joke of it, you're toothless for 4 months. Everyone's like, are you okay? I'm fine. No tooth. My family being like, what is going on? I think I told my mum that I had fallen from my bed and fallen onto an adapter, like a plug.
Yeah.
Like one of those.
Yeah, that'll do it.
I mean, whether she believed it or not, because I was also in a home that was very anti-conflict, which I realize now was because of the way conflict was handled with my father. My mum was never able to have direct conversation. So that ended up being a repeated pattern with me.
I get it.
Which is so fascinating because she was still repeating that pattern of avoiding conflict. But I was the embodiment of conflict and repeating my father's pattern. So it's almost like she had to experience her husband again, but through her daughter. And I can't imagine. I speak to her now about it. She's so open, so beautiful, my mum. I speak to her about it often so that I can really understand her psychological experience at the time. So for me, that's the role alcohol played. And I ended up relapsing 7 times, finally got sober in 2016 at 24. And then that's when I started sharing about sobriety, etc.
Wow, you've been sober since 2016?
Yes, so nearly 9 years. 9 years this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But that's how I've been led to the work that I do. And I think that part of my journey is crucial.
Yes.
Because I never want people to think that I'm high and mighty speaking about how everyone should be braver in their expression and that it's just been overnight. There is that huge spark that was created by my open letter nearly 4 years ago now. which is mad.
Oh yeah, tell us about the open
But there
line.
was so much leading up to it. And that story that I'm sharing now is a part of it. Because when I started sharing in 2016, my work was labeled immediately as advocacy. And in a lot of ways it was. I was sharing my own story.
Yeah.
But eventually I started to get curious about the alcohol industry as a whole. I wanted to understand how alcohol was being marketed to women in particular.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
And I wanted to understand how people of marginalized people and people of working class heritage have a different type of relationship with alcohol, how we view addiction differently when it's with someone that is working class versus someone that is middle to upper class. So my work became very objective quite quickly. That's when I came across the term self-sabotage. And then I realized, oh, there's this thing that happens where we pull the plug on ourselves when we're actually doing very well, because it meant that I could understand my relapsing more. So a lot of the work that I do now pretty much started from there, but it was labeled active advocacy to begin with, and then activism shortly after that. And I really think that allowed for me to take my own work very seriously, which is where labels are useful, because people were recognizing it as important work. It was no longer just me sharing my personal story in a kind of sort of like an open journal, which it was in the beginning. But then once you're labeled an activist, you're expected to be an activist in other areas, right? That's the sort of idea of intersectionality. And again, I was okay with that at the time. But then there were expectations for me to talk about sobriety as a Black woman, talk about sobriety as an immigrant, talk about sobriety as a left-leaning Black woman who's an immigrant.
Right, because in the intersectional universe, you kind of win a prize or something.
I have so many. I have so many ribbons to wear. But then there's an expectation for you to no longer just speak about something in sort of one one format, if you will, of exploration. It has to be so many other things. And again, this is from 2016. I was fine with that because I wanted to understand. I wanted to be curious about, okay, what does addiction actually look like as a Black woman? Is it different?
Right. Is it different?
Is it? I think it can be. I think there are cultural differences, full stop, when it comes to everything. I don't know that it's just confined to as a Black woman, because what Black are we talking about? Because Nigerian, Somali,
like,
Kenyan, very different.
It seems so silly lumping together like all Black people.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
But at the time, I think I just started to become more and more entrenched in social justice spaces because of the origins of my work.
Okay.
And I really want to make this clear. I was not forced into it. I wanted to do it.
Yeah.
But around 2018, I started to notice a shift. Actually, in the 2016, it was already intense because of everything that was happening with Trump the conversation, the kind of politicization of everything. But 2018 is when I started to notice that over the policing of language, which was happening externally, but also started to happen in my own mind. And I considered myself to be very open-minded. I considered myself to be very brave and curious because of what I'd already been doing. But I started to notice that there were areas that were kind of no-go areas. You just don't go there. Stay here, but you just don't go there. You don't question anything.
Like what? Can you give me an example?
Certain things to do with race.
Okay.
You don't question certain mantras around, be it silence is violence, or even just the idea that every white person is born racist and they have to go through this process of anti-racism. And even just hearing that, to me, it was a red flag because there was something quite religious about it. It almost had this idea of the original sin. I grew up in fundamentalist religion, not for a long time, but I'm from a Christian culture anyway, but my mother found herself in a sort of cult-like. So I was familiar with these kind of very coercive cult-like patterns. The idea of the original sin, that you're born a sinner.
You were hyper attuned to this from your childhood.
Goodness.
Like, so you put you in the perfect position.
Oh my goodness.
To say, wait, what's going on here?
But I couldn't ask that.
Yeah.
Because for me to say, wait, actually, when we say white people, which white people are we talking about? Then it seems as if I'm questioning the movement.
Right.
So again, in the beginning, it didn't seem like a big deal to kind of keep some things to myself. But gradually, when you start justifying keeping something to yourself, especially when you're truly curious and you don't understand, or there are quite obvious contradictions, we say we want progress, But it's interesting that we're using extremely intolerant tactics, including not asking any questions, right? Having a list of people that are so-called problematic that you can't listen to. So I'm not allowed to listen to Jordan Peterson, not allowed to listen to Joe Rogan, not allowed to listen to anyone that is on the right, and I didn't question any of these things, which is what also started to ring alarms for me in 2020.
I'm safe though. You can listen to Scott Barry Kaufman.
Now I'm
safe. I'm
safe.
Yeah. Chill.
And chill. And so for me, 2018, I never want people to think that open letter, which I encourage people to read, that it just happened in a burst in time. It was very gradual, me starting to realize that there are things that I'm not allowed to question.
Gotcha.
But no one is even telling me explicitly externally. I'm starting to self-police and overly self-edit in a way that is very unnatural. Yeah. And by the time 2020 came around, it all just took a different turn, and I couldn't unsee the things that I saw.
Gotcha.
Because I saw my own intolerance in a way that was very shocking to the system. I saw my own fear as well, and I'll get very specific about what I mean. But especially with the conversations around race, all of the fallout after George Floyd's murder, I just realized that I was so afraid of seeing things in a different way because it felt like a betrayal to, again, the Black community. No specificity as to what Black community we're talking about, but essentially every Black person that exists. If I don't quite agree with the just very harsh and intolerant approach that is being taken in terms of getting white people to understand what is happening, if I push back on that, that means I'm pushing back against the mission of Black people.
You're almost you're almost betraying your people.
100%.
Yeah.
Like a big pressure. And then I realized that it wasn't just that moment in time. I had felt this when it came to feminism, that I couldn't have compassion and empathy for men because it would mean that I'm a Pikme, or it would mean that I am...
I've never heard that before.
Right?
Pikme?
Pikme. That is a term that is used for women that justify men's behavior because they want to be picked by men.
Oh, I see.
So they side with misogyny. They side with all of these things because they want to be picked.
Well, you taught me something new today.
Gosh, but it's so extreme that you don't even need to be siding with misogyny. You can just say you have empathy and compassion for men, or that you love your husband, or that you want to cater to him, or that you don't mind being submissive to your partner. So for me, Scott, 2020, and I'd love to know your experience of this, because being in the position that you are, not only someone that is visible and very much out there in the world, which means a lot of people have access to you. A lot of people might have demands of you, but you're also a psychologist, which means people might have a certain expectation for you to comment on things. It was such I really don't think that we've truly processed the psychological damage that happened to most of us in 2020, not just because of the racial tensions and the suspicion that we suddenly had of each other, and this pushing for people to look at everything through a very racialized lens, where you're supposed to look for malicious intent in your interactions with people. It's a lens.
You just said it. It's 100%. There are a lot of different lenses on offer in the world, and that's a lens. Yeah.
So I bought into that very rigid, one-dimensional way of viewing the world, and I never would have thought that I would buy into that, and I did. And it's important for people to understand that we have so many stories about what we will and will not do, how we will respond with external pressures and groupthink and what, but you never know. I was very humbled by my own intolerance and fear. I was very humbled by my response and demands for people to respond in a very specific way, and my inability to hold nuance. And at this point in time, I was already a developmental coach. I'd been studying self-sabotage for a long time. I'd been a researcher for a long time. So again, all of these titles would make you think you should know better, but I didn't.
No.
And that sort of broke me out of this trance and led me to write the letter, Why I'm Leaving the Cult of Wokeness, where I essentially made a declaration and owned up to my own intolerance and just really invited us all to question what we're seeing around us.
It did very well, right? I mean,
it really did.
You got like millions of...
It exploded.
So and it hit the nerve of what a lot of people maybe had been feeling at that point.
Especially the silent majority.
Yeah.
Especially those people that are very much an embodiment of that third perspective
Sure.
that I talk about, the people that don't neatly fit into left or right, into
Totally.
pro or anti, into are you woke or anti-woke. You know, the majority of people that are just like, I am doing my best, but the goalpost keeps on moving.
Yes.
You know.
I'm glad you said that. And
Yeah.
is it okay if we just pause there a second?
Please,
Let me
please.
pick up the ball that you just threw at me. So, because personally, I don't like these divisions in, like, I would never, I'm not woke. I've written this before on Twitter.
Yeah.
I'm not woke, but I'm also not anti-woke.
Yes.
You know, like,
yes, no.
I would like the freedom to be able to pick and choose what I want to be a free thinker.
Yes.
Right? If you put yourself even in the anti-woke camp, I feel like that limits your free thinking.
Me too.
And then you get caught up in this thing where you're no longer allowed to agree with anyone who's so-called woke. I mean, there are some things that so-called woke people say. I'm like, totally, you know, like, they're right. They've got a point, you know, like, we should be more mindful and sensitive to some things, you know, like, I don't want us to go in the complete opposite direction where we become assholes, you know, and we have no sensitivity at all. But I see that sometimes there's like an exact opposite end where they're kind of like assholes. Am I allowed to say that?
100%. And I think we need to say that more, because something that I made a very conscious decision about that in the beginning when I started talking about a lot of what I talk about now. I knew that it could be so easy for this to end up being a case of I'm leaving the left and going to the right, you know, and I was never someone that over-identified with any political leaning. I live by my values. And for me, actually, as an immigrant, it's not the norm for us to go to another country and tie ourselves with a new political identity, because a lot of the time, and this was the case for me and my family, we're leaving environments that lack so much freedom, where you're truly punished for not taking a strong stance, where you don't get a chance to critique your leaders, where you don't get a chance to be nuanced in your thinking, which is why you have a lot of immigrants, even people that have left the Soviet Union, which wasn't even a long time ago, that are saying, hey, in the West, we need to stop politicizing the idea of freedom. We need to allow for people to externalize their ideas. We need to allow for people to disagree. You have people saying, you don't know what you have. And I'm one of those people.
Wow.
But I was so intentional about not calling everything woke and not blah, blah, blah.
Right.
I used the term wokeness very intentionally in my open letter because I needed it to be a Trojan horse. I did. And when you read the letter, I think why it resonated with so many people, especially left-leaning people, is that I spoke about the value in the language of woke. I honored its origins and its beauty. And I also made it very clear that you have bad faith actors who didn't even realize that they're bad faith actors, who have hijacked the movement and turned it into an ideological sort of cesspit, which is called wokeness, which I think is a very different thing, you know. But you will notice in my words and in what I share, I never refer to the woke, because I think that's a very self-righteous, ineffective position to
doing
take.
Exactly what you criticize.
It's doing the exact same thing. So you end up that horseshoe theory, right? You end up holding
you don't
hands.
Want to become
it's the exact same thing.
Yeah, you don't want to become the same thing on the other side.
And I see that a lot with the anti-woke.
I do too.
They're extremely intolerant.
Yeah.
They use dehumanizing language. Yeah. And they love cancel culture. If it's happening to the person on the opposite side of the street, they absolutely love it and they don't even realize it.
Well, they use it for themselves to get a bigger platform and to get money, you know,
and become caricatures.
Yeah.
It's so sad how with people, there were some people in the beginning of my own awakening and really starting to break out of my own echo chambers, who I really admired, who I really saw as people that were very important, but they quickly became caricatures of themselves. And I wouldn't even be able to sit here now and mention a long list of people that I still admire who are on that side of the street. I can take what I need and still honor their work. But I think it's people for me like Aisha Akanbi, who's a good friend, and Salome, who I know we both love, who are just in integrity. And they've allowed their voices to truly evolve in a way that is authentic. And they don't play into the divisive games. They know that they could take the easy route of sort of, again, becoming anti-woke caricatures and voices. But they decide not to do that because they actually care about unity and bridging that gap, and they're genuinely curious. But I think it's such a shame when we leave one echo chamber and neatly walk right into another. So that's something that I'm always mindful about in my work and what I do.
Wonderful, wonderful. I mean, I see you as a humanistic sister of my world. Oh. I mean, I stay away from the woke and all that. That's just the whole, why do we need to be in that world? Like, no. I'm a humanistic psychologist, yes. And I am unequivocally like applying universal values, and that's it. I mean, we don't need to put a label on that other than humanistic. Yes. But I consider you, an ally in the humanistic. I don't use the word ally that frequently, but I view you as an ally in the humanistic psychology tradition.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
It's actually why I resonate again and just value and revere you and your work. And I'm so thankful that we get to sit together and talk about this, because you get me excited about the work that I do, because wonderful. I can feel your heart and what you do. And I know you've been doing this for a very long time, but I love that you don't shy. You don't look a day over what age?
30 what? How old I look? 30 what?
My clubs now. Not a day over 31. I think it's like it just validates what we do, and you don't shy away from speaking about the things that are happening culturally, which you can tell me what you think on this, because you're more in that space. I think a lot of professionals, healthcare professionals, are really terrified of this culture, but I think they are the people we really need to be talking about the intricacies of what it means to be a human being and the psychology of it, and why a lot of the sort of mantras and phrases and positions we take are so simplistic.
Interesting. I would be careful for people, if I could give advice to people. I'd be careful to not have self-fulfilling prophecies. And I am very mindful of creating spaces and situations where negative self-fulfilling, I'm okay with positive self-fulfilling. Yes. But if you even encounter, like, let's say someone is like quote woke, and then you're like terrified of them, you're already setting the tone and they'll pick up on it.
Yes.
They'll be like, this person seems like they're terrified of me. And then they'll respond in kind. And then you'll be like, oh, they're acting like they're terrified of me. Right. And then before you know it, two people are like not liking each other because of the expectations they brought into it. I really am an advocate of fresh eyes, with everyone you meet, just like a little kid, just like wonder and awe. I'm in wonder of awe of everyone, like everyone I meet. Everyone, like, I try not to listen to things, people gossip. They're like, oh, you shouldn't talk to them, or you should, there are people that I, became friends with, people like, oh, you shouldn't be friends with that person. And I'm like, but why? I enjoy talking to them.
Yeah, I really love and appreciate that you say that, because I think it really brings it back to the self, because sometimes when we speak about these big topics like censorship or cancel culture, whatever, it can resonate in the moment because we all know intuitively what it looks like and feels like. But I think it feels so big. It's like, where do I even begin with this? But I love to bring it back to the self. And you'll see that I do that a lot in the book.
You do?
Because I want it to feel so manageable. It really is. In again, like the micro moments, the micro interactions, when you meet someone, instead of leading with filtering them through an identity. So this person is black, this person is this, so they probably can't handle it. You then drown in a world of assumptions, and you treat people based on assumption, not even truth. Yeah. So I think when you allow yourself to be like, I wonder how this person will surprise me, or how will I surprise myself? That's what I like to do in conversations.
People continually surprise me.
Right?
Yeah. But you just said is also very interesting, surprising yourself. What does that mean? Can you double click on that?
To me,
give me a moment when you've surprised yourself.
I even love that language, because surprising myself is in moments where I no longer assume what I can or cannot handle.
Yeah.
Okay? I can handle discomfort. Am I able to surprise myself in this moment where someone says something and then I get what I call the initial ouch, where I'm like, ooh, I really don't agree with that. Okay, why would this person say that?
See.
It's all this. Then I'm like, and then I lean just a little bit in, and to be like, okay, how can I be surprised by this person? Because maybe they're going to follow up with something, but then maybe I could say, why do you think that? Instead of immediately attacking, right? I surprise myself by listening to people that I have been told, especially in the earlier days, I've been told this person's evil, problematic, they're bad, they're a bigot. Okay, let me listen for myself. Let me surprise myself. Can I resonate with even one thing? I can discard the rest. I don't have to agree with every single thing. What's one thing?
Right.
I can surprise myself.
I
can
that.
surprise myself in conversations where, even though I feel terrified, I can respond in a way that's a tiny little bit more assertive than I would. I don't have an opinion on this. Instead of me blindly agreeing or being like scared, because we forget that we're animals. So we emit this smell and energy of, I'm terrified. What if I surprise myself and say, I don't know what I think about that. You know, it's so gentle.
Well, I love that approach. I love that approach. You talk about something in your book that I want to double click on. You talk about the fear of exploration, and I'm a big fan of overcoming that fear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell me.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, since you asked, I wrote a book called Choose Growth with Jordan Feingold.
Amazing.
And the whole book is about choosing exploration versus fear. So I'm like all about that.
Yes.
And we have, workbook exercise and things to help people get outside their comfort zone and do that. So when I saw that in your book, I was like, yes, sister. May I call you a sister?
Please, I love it when you do that.
That's not politically incorrect?
No, it feels so lovely.
Consider you.
Why would it be? Oh, because I'm black?
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
a little bit.
I said not I didn't say sister.
No,
Michael, we'll cut some of this.
It does.
Okay.
It's like that thing. Have you? Why? So you're saying you're going to self-censor? You're going to censor this conversation?
Well, that was also 50% a joke saying we'll cut it, but we'll see. I love this idea of fear of exploration.
Yes.
Can you please tell me what you're thinking about and how can people overcome that fear? Why do people have that fear?
You know what? To me, when I say that, I think I mainly want to think about it as, don't be afraid to even explore that fear. Okay. Because a lot of what we're talking about here it's really uncomfortable. I want to honor the fact that, and I say this in the book, that I'm asking people to do something that is quite unnatural. So introspection and self-scrutiny and looking at your own shit, lifting up the carpet and seeing all of these sort of goals. It's not the norm. And I want to acknowledge that. It's so easy as human beings to externalize. We look at what everyone else is doing wrong. How can I stay safe because of what other people are doing or not doing? And that's normal. So I want us to look inward. And I know this is a big, big part of your work, that you actually can't change much externally if you're not willing to see what's happening internally. And then to ask yourself, is this working for me or against me? So to me, fear, especially looking at it in the eye, the fear of exploration is actually looking at the fear in and of itself. What am I afraid of?
Love it.
What do I think is going to happen if I speak? And what do I actually even want to say? Because when a lot of people say things like, if I speak up, I will lose my job, my kids, my family. I'm like, what do you want to say? What are the things? And then you ask someone and they realize, actually, maybe I don't even have a clear opinion. I just have this feeling that if I speak the truth, I'll be punished for it.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. I think a lot of people are afraid of shame. We live in a shame-based.
That's it.
Don't you think that's
it?
We live in
100%.
such a shame-based culture where it's like, even you hear the protesters going around saying shame, shame.
Yes.
That's their tactic. Yeah.
And it's so ancient, isn't it? Because it feels like, again, I'm not even a religious person, but there's something so religious about it. The whole village chanting shame, shame,
You're
shame,
right.
being publicly stoned. But now we just do it in comment sections.
On Twitter or X.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, let's be okay with exploring, the fear. Let's be okay with exploring the discomfort. Let's be okay with seeing where a conversation is going to go without trying to control its outcome.
Absolutely.
Experience what it looks like to hear a joke that is kind of crude in some way, but a part of you finds it funny. What if you were to lean into that laugh? If it feels like you're in a safe space with someone that you know.
We did that today at multiple moments.
Exactly. Like allow for yourself to be open to whatever feels intuitive.
Yeah.
To
I'm
me,
still
that's
laughing
all.
at some of the things we've discussed today.
To me, that's all part of exploration.
Yeah.
What about you? What do you think?
About what you just said? What I think about what you
or
just said?
generally the idea or what exploration can look like in this culture that we find ourselves in.
It would just change everything. It would be a game changer if people had more social curiosity with each other. And kind of led with their social curiosity, as opposed to leading with their ideology, leading with their. But I feel like the more I talk, the more I'm kind of preaching to the choir over here, because I found myself nodding in vigorous agreement with so much of your book. Let me see. I just want to read some quotes from maybe because we're running out of time. So let me read some of my favorite quotes from your book.
By the way, that I can't not say this again. That hat. Can you wear it all the time?
Do you think it suits me?
Yes.
Okay, maybe this will be my new hat for the Psychology Podcast.
I think so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll see. I tend to. I like being unique with each guest though as well.
And I love
that also may be the case, which is this hat might be unique to you.
Yeah.
And select
so this
other
is
sisters.
My moment. Oh, that laugh. Oh my God.
Ers, not us, not us, sisters. Okay.
Sisters with a heart,
with a heart, yes. I feel like I can't say sisters. Okay, so
I can't. I'm done.
I do have people. One of the most commented things on the Psychology Podcast comment section is about my laugh.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I can't help it. It's visceral.
I feel it in my root chakra.
It's pretty visceral.
Yeah.
Pretty visceral. I'm going to quote Africa Brooke.
Please.
When you let go of the incessant need to cling on to a single story, you open doors to more interesting conversations, deeper understanding, and greater empathy.
Yes.
How can people not cling on to a single story so tightly? What does a single story bring them psychologically? Safety?
But it's exactly what we're talking about now. There are those sort of very temporary rewards, right?
Yeah.
Of feeling safe, not having to go into the unknown, which again can then bring discomfort. But that single story doesn't allow for you to even see a second, third, fourth, fifth perspective. And it also doesn't allow for you to meet yourself at a different level. Because if we're going back to that idea of surprising yourself, how can I surprise myself if I'm always clinging to a single story and I never want it to change? Because a part of me will always feel like, we've outgrown this. We don't really think this anymore. We don't agree with that. But you're suppressing it. I want you to picture, when I said earlier about lifting the carpet and the sort of ghouls looking up at you, they just want to be heard. To me, that's a useful visual in how we take parts of ourselves and we just shove them under the carpet. They just want to be heard. They don't expect you to agree with them all the time. They don't expect you to take them as part of your full-time identity. But they want to be heard. Otherwise, they become very resentful. They become very frustrated. And they become very lonely because they're discarded in there. So that's how I like to humanize myself. So a single story never actually serves me. Sometimes it might feel like it does, and you might need it at points in time to create your own sense of safety. But I don't know that for the rest of your life, as you meet more people, as you have more conversations, as you get older, I don't know that it's useful.
Oh my gosh.
It takes more than it gives.
I love it. Look, I enjoyed talking with you so much, Shane. There's so much we could still discuss. I don't know how much we even talked about the third perspective.
No, we did. All of this was.
But I want to end by making it clear to everyone, this whole framework we got out today is what you call the third perspective.
Yes.
We have to make sure we get that in. And I'm going to title this episode probably something relating to the third perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the Psychology Podcast today and for everything you're bringing to the world to bring more. I'm co-opting you into the humanistic psychology movement.
Oh, please, please take me.
I really consider you part of the brother sisterhood of humanistic psychology. So
this was beautiful. One of my favorite conversations that I've had, and I'm not just saying it. I'm saying that because I feel an expansion within me. I feel validated in my voice and my mission and what I'm doing. And you're someone that I deeply respect.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.